It became difficult to know whether some people naturally spoke in a particular manner or were only doing it because that was how some character in the column spoke. By now, the columnist Miles Nagopaleen had supplanted the novelist Flann O'Brien and had even taken over from Brian O'Nolan.
Irish Times, Crushkeen Lawn by Miles Nagopaleen, The Gaelic. A lady lecturing recently on the Irish language drew attention to the fact, I mentioned it myself as long ago as 1925, that while the average English speaker gets along with a mere 400 words, the Irish-speaking peasant uses 4,000. Considering what most English speakers can achieve with their tiny fund of noises, it is a nice speculation to what extremity one would be reduced if one were locked up for a day with an Irish-speaking bore and bereft of all means of committing murder or suicide.
I used to have to deal with his copy when it came into the office in the Irish Times, and I was delighted and entranced by the clarity and simplicity of the prose. It was as clear as gin, beautiful. And punctuation, everything. Of course, nobody would presume to sub-edit Miles. My job was to read it for legal trouble, you know. Had he gone over the top? Sometimes you didn't know, and sometimes you knew damn well.
I think he sweated blood over the things because he must have rewritten and rewritten them because they were always, in the long run, perfectly typed. Sometimes he would make a small change, again in his own funny, broad handwriting, always in Parker pen and with black ink. I think he must have worked over. He was very conscious. He was a very conscious artist in a sense, you know, because he really wrote what he heard. He had an interior ear for dialogue and all that. He had the sort of Joycean ear for Dublinese and so on. And it must go in a certain way. A redundant comma would spoil it. And if that redundant comma got in, he was very upset.
The plight of the English speaker with his wretched box of 400 vocal beads may be imagined when I say that a really good Irish speaker would blurt out the whole 400 in one cosmic grunt. In Donegal, there are native speakers who know so many million words that it is a matter of pride with them never to use the same word twice in a lifetime. Their life, not to say their language, becomes very complex at the century mark. But there you are.
Although Miles Nagopaleen enjoyed a considerable celebrity, Brian O'Nolan still spent his days here in the Custom House as a civil servant in the Department of Local Government. He had thoughts of being a professional writer, even of making what he called big money out of a book. But there was no tradition of professional writing in Dublin. Most of the literary men in the Pearl and the Palace had respectable jobs, and there was a strong streak of respectability in himself.
When he put his mind to it, he could have been a very good civil servant indeed. But of course he had, as we say in this country, the little weakness, and that interfered very much with his concentration on the job. He had one of the skills a civil servant ought to have, I think, is the capacity of getting on easily with people. And on the whole, there's a very high level of courtesy in the civil service here. But he was not easy to get on with in that respect. He wasn't much for small talk or chatting around. That was all confined to the licensed premises around, or what he used to call his office in Scotch House, across the river there.
Thank you. When things go wrong and will not come right,
though you do the best you can. When life looks black as the hour of night, a pint of plain is your only man.
When money's tight and hard to get, and your horse is also ran, when all you have is a heap of debt, a pint of plain is your only man.
When health is bad and your heart feels strange and your face is pale and wan, when the doctors say you need a change, a pint of plain is your only man.
When food is scarce and your lard are bare, and no rashers grease your pan, when hunger grows as the meals grow rare, a pint of plain is your only man.
In times of trouble and lousy strife, you've still got a darling plan. You still can turn to a brighter life.
A pint of plain is your only man.
He asked me out a few times. Well, I didn't put any pass on that. I was well used to going out with people and having a livelier time than I would have with him. In fact, I loved dancing and all that kind of thing, and I had men that I could go with. But he didn't go in for that at all. He would always want supper and a few drinks and that kind of quieter life, you know. He asked me to marry him about the second or third time I was out with him, though I knew him in the office, but that was only through work and we weren't in the same room or anything. He had an old car at the time, and we'd go off out to Wicklow or somewhere and have a meal, and he'd have a few drinks, and I'd be left home in the most respectable way, etc., with a laugh. I knew he took drink, but I didn't know it was the disease it is that I know all about today, you know.
Although Kavanagh, unlike Miles, was a supposed freelance writer, and although he had freed himself from the sort of bourgeois respectability which still dogged Miles's days, he certainly did not live in any sort of an ivory tower.
I lived in Pembroke Road for about 17 years, but I have no love for that place today. For it was in that area that I starred and experienced the double face of Dublin. But I also knew much pleasure sitting on the steps and talking to the neighbours and their children.
If ever you go to Dublin town in 100 years or so, inquire for me in Bagot Street and what I was like to know. On Pembroke Road, look out for my ghost, dishevelled with shoes untied, playing through the railings with little children whose children have long since died.
For many years, indeed, I was a familiar feature or fixture of the scene around Bagot Street Bridge, fluctuating between the steps facing Bagot Street Hospital, Parsons' bookshop, and leaning over the bridge itself. If ever you go to Dublin town in 100 years or so, inquire for me in Bagot Street and what I was like to know.
You want to know about Paddy Kavanagh? He was a very noticed character in the area, of course, and he was known in most of the shops and most of the pubs in the area. But this seemed to be his local, that he came here every morning about 11:30, had his few drinks and read his papers, and mostly on his own, drank on his own.
Well, I used to often meet him here in the morning times and things like that when I was going to work. And I found him a jolly type of man. But sometimes he'd be in bad humour, you know, but you have to take him as you met him, you know what I mean?
But Paddy Kavanagh, I thought he was a dirty old man. He used to be hawking and spitting and coughing, and then he'd spit out a dirty old yellow spit.
He's quite pleasant, actually. Used to buy his meat and rashers and sausages and stuff like that, you know. He was well known around the area. I didn't know him when he started coming in first, like, you know, and then got to know him. Quite pleasant man.
Well, we weren't great friends, I might add. that he was a genius, no doubt, a great admiration for his work, but, you know, as the man himself, he wasn't all that nice. Very abrupt and, you know, and insult you up to the eyes. So there you are.
As you want to know about Patrick Kavanagh, well, I knew him very well. We worked for him. And he also was able to repair shoes himself. But I found him to be, it was very hard to put into words how one would assess him. A very funny, not a funny comical character, but a funny type of person to understand. But there again, I suppose all these type of people are poets and so forth. They're supposed to be eccentric. But, yeah.
Poverty is a mental condition. You hear of men and women who have chosen poverty, but you cannot choose poverty. Poverty has nothing to do with eating your fill today. It is anxiety about what's going to happen next week. The cliché poverty that you get in the working class novel or play is a formula. And my father, being a shoemaker, was probably less poor than the small farmer classes. What was called the drop in a shilling kept coming in. And actually, the real poverty was the lack of enlightenment. Above all, the enlightenment to get out.
In spite of the spaciousness of its streets and its apparent air of leisure and ease, Dublin in the 1950s was a claustrophobic and constricting place, where everybody knew everybody else, took a great interest in their success or failure, and wished them, on the whole, anything but well. The possibility of leaving it was a constant preoccupation with many, especially perhaps the more independent-minded.
Well, I think that many riders ran from Dublin. Beckett ran. Beckett stood on the Leary Pier and said he had a vision. Whether he had or not, I don't know, but he left and never came back. Johnny said he wouldn't come back to Dublin because he thought he'd be shot if he came back. I, of course, have not made up my mind one way or the other whether to be shot or jump off the Leary Pier. But the people who remained here, like Kavanagh and our Brendan, were killed by Dublin. Dublin killed them. Our Brendan, for example, wanted to live in New York. He said New York had a respect for the artist, Dublin had none. But both of them remained here. They were drawn back to it by circumstances. And in the end, of course, the begrudging city killed him. It's the fashion in Dublin never to speak well of anybody. They say about somebody, oh, he couldn't write two words. You couldn't put two words together. And although if you live with it and you're part of it, it is a negative killing thing. But yet, if you go abroad, it is the whetstone to your axe.
Elsewhere was the place where Joyce went, for instance, and where Shaw had gone in his time. Elsewhere, the idea was get away from here. And of course, the suggestion that this too was rather provincial was always an obsession with them. Again, I don't think it's very true, and I don't think it had any real bearing on the facts, because actually what they were getting from here was more important than what they were getting elsewhere. I mean, they were getting their own genuine culture, which they could feel inside themselves. Most of them never even got out of the place mentally. They might physically get out, but never, not really.
Fame, as it advanced to meet Brendan Behan in the late 1950s, was on a staggering scale. Perhaps the simplest thing to say is that it overwhelmed him. There was an exhibitionist side to his nature, which those who manipulated the fame-making apparatus happily exploited, and his misery, for one can only call it that, was increased by the knowledge that he was famous for the wrong reasons.
You've appeared on television, quote, drunk, unquote, and it's your own quote at that. You didn't feel, for instance, ashamed of this.
Why should I feel ashamed?